For a really long time, I've been wanting to do an episode on religion and ecology. Religious principles, their practices have a huge impact on our environment, both good and bad. So I thought I should speak to some of the leaders, the believers, and people who are associated with religion in a way or another, and find out if religion could be used to unite people to fight against climate change. And consequently, I found there's several religious declarations on climate change being written. There's a Christian declaration, there's a Hindu, Islamic, Jain, Jewish, Sikh, Buddhist declaration on climate change. There's so many. Today we're going to discuss the Jain declaration on climate change. Jain monks and nuns are the real environmentalists, as they hardly leave any carbon footprint on earth. So Jainism has a different set of rules for its monks and nuns and a different set of rules for its lay people. Today we'll be discussing a few Jain vows like non-violence, renunciation, non-possession, which are all very efficient tools in this fight against climate change. But we'll be focusing more on how well are they being practiced by its followers. So let's meet Dr. Jinashah and Sudhanshu Jain, who've co-written the Jain Declaration on Climate Change.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jinashah. I'm a physician trained in family medicine and another specialty called general preventive medicine. And I'm the chairperson of the Ahimsic Eco-Vegan Committee of Jina, which is the Federation of Jain Associations of North America. And with Sudhanshu Jain, I co-authored the Jain Declaration on the Climate Crisis.
So my mom is from Old Delhi, Daryaganj, and my father is from Saharanpur, and they came to the U.S. when I was 2 years old. So I did all of my schooling here. I went to MIT, got 2 engineering degrees, and then I worked in technology doing integrated circuit designs for 25 years. And towards the end of that, I started getting a little more involved in environmental issues. We were planting trees in the hills behind Stanford University. And then when I saw Al Gore's movie Inconvenient Truth, I decided that I have to devote my life to this. This is the most important issue. Climate change threatens, basically all human civilization. So I decided that my energies would be best spent working on climate change issues. So the first organization I got involved with was an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which is lobbying the federal government to impose a carbon tax or a price on carbon in the United States. And I'd been working on that now for 11 years. But one of the things that they had was they were having trouble convincing a lot of American Christians to be concerned about climate change. And there are sort of 2 different philosophies. One is that man has dominion over the earth. That means they can do whatever they want with it. The other philosophy is man has stewardship over the earth, which means that you're the caretaker of the earth and you're responsible for making the earth sustainable and thriving. So what Citizens Climate Lobby did was they decided they had to get a bunch of faith communities involved in the climate change movement. So they collected the faith statements from all different religions, from Islam, different Christian sects, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist. So they collected this and put it in a book. And when I saw that the Jain statement was missing. So I've been involved in sort of, we have a temple here in the Bay Area in Milpitas. So I was on the construction committee for that temple. That was in 2000. So I've been involved pretty actively in Jain conferences and talking to a lot of Jains since 2000. So Jinashah and we wrote this Jain Declaration on the climate crisis. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, I guess.
So there are two things which majority of Jains practice very religiously. One is they lead a vegetarian life, and second is they try not to harm anyone knowingly. But what about indirect harm? What about human activities that lead to violence at some stage which is not visible to us right now?
That Jains focus too much on what I consider to be direct or active violence. So if you were to kill a worm when you compost, versus the inactive violence, the indirect violence, where if you throw a plastic bag into the ocean and then a turtle eats the bag and then dies because it thought that a plastic bag was a jellyfish, right? You didn't actually strike the turtle, but your ignorance, you might say, has caused the turtle to be harmed. And, we're talking about basically 5 cents being. So I think that not enough Jains are concerned about what I consider to be indirect violence. And the scripture even talks about this. Let me read a passage here. Okay. The Jains argue that all violence is intended violence. They argue it is not possible for a person to be so ignorant and yet not guilty. His very ignorance and carelessness constitute an intent to do violence and imply correspondingly his guilt. And then another passage is, according to Jainism, the moral imperative to practice ahimsa includes the requirement to remove the ignorance that would prevent a person from seeing the violence embodied in his or her actions. So, when people are ignorant of climate change, and we have these wildfires, and we have sea level rise, and we have, thousands of people being extincted, thousands of species being extincted, that is a form of indirect violence due to ignorance.
So majority of the Jains prefer not to eat stale food to avoid harming the microorganisms that grow on them. But because they do not eat them, they end up throwing them into the dustbin. So I want you to speak about the food wastage, which has become a huge problem in our times, and also about composting, which is again not approved by a lot of Jains.
In the days before there was refrigeration, food that was not eaten or given away would grow unhealthy bacteria, and so it would be unsafe to consume. Now, with refrigeration, it does not make sense to throw food away. There was a question and answer with the first Jain Sadhvi to take Diksha in the US. This was in California a few years ago. And somebody asked her about whether it's okay in Jainism to refrigerate foods, or should it be thrown away and have new food made every day? The concept in Gujarati is vasi food. Is it okay to eat vasi food? And she said, well, of course, it's better to refrigerate than to throw food away. So if somebody has this improper understanding and feels they must throw food away, they have to understand the times have changed. But if we come back to the original intention of the rule not to have vasi food, it's so that we don't generate waste. We have to look at the original idea of this rule. About composting, I have not heard any Jain nuns or monks discuss composting in India or the US, so I don't know if there's an official position on it. I do, from my own experience, know that in India, there's so many animals around people's homes that it's easy to give food scraps and food peels for them to eat. Composting is also good in terms of preventing landfill waste and release of greenhouse gases. But I also have vegan friends that have compost bins, and there are a number of worms at the bottom of the bins, and they cannot figure out how to move the bins without killing the worms.
I'm a vegan, but a lot of Jains have yogurt, right? They have fermented food that has living cultures in it. So I think that that's a contradiction.
In the last couple of years, veganism has become very popular among a lot of people for various reasons. Today, there are some restaurants in the cities that will offer you vegan food. But because Jainism believes in ahimsa, non-violence, is veganism being discussed much more seriously within the Jain community?
So in the production of dairy products, a female cow that we call mother in India endures a lot of suffering and is killed prematurely. This may be hard for people to accept given the culture, but a female cow is only able to give milk when she's pregnant, just like a human mother only lactates or gives milk when she's pregnant. So in order to maximize production, she's artificially kept pregnant, semen is injected into her, she is separated from her babies so that her babies cannot drink her milk and we can take her milk, we as humans. If her baby cow is male, there is no use for him in the dairy industry. Maybe in the old days there was some need for bulls to plow the fields, but these days there's not as much need for such bulls as are generated in the dairy industry. If the baby of the female cow is female, she's raised to be a dairy cow. Her body is violated in order to keep her pregnant. She has so many pregnancies in her life that her normal lifespan of 20 years is shortened to 5 or less. Some people think that in India, this is a better situation. They think back to traditional times. It should be known that current practices in India are also very cruel. The animal is not treated as a human pet or a worthy living being. The animal is treated as an economic commodity. Veganism is an important action step that an individual can take, because not only is it a cruel form of hinsa to the cows, it's also hinsa to the earth and all of us living beings on the earth. Raising cows contributes to climate change because of the intensity of land and water use needed to breed cows and the pollution created by their waste, their belching and their release of gas, their solid waste. This pollutes the environment and contributes to greenhouse gases. It would be a misperception for someone to say that if we don't have dairy, that they would slaughter the cows. Because if we do not demand dairy products, dairy cows will not be bred. We are intentionally breeding them, we meaning humans. Just like if there's less demand for meat, the market responds. They don't breed these animals for meat. And currently, dairy cows are being killed when they cannot give milk anymore, and their male children are killed. So it's already inextricably linked to slaughter.
It's really shocking because what we find is that a lot of Jains have this sort of historic view that of the family cow, and the family cow is treated so well, and they don't understand. I mean, even my parents talked about how, when the cow got old, they gave it to, somebody else in the community, and they sort of didn't think about what would happen to that cow after they gave it away.
One person that I wanted to mention who had been convinced by this, how horrible this is a very respected, eminent scholar of Jainism. Padmanabh Jaini is an emeritus, that means now retired, a very distinguished professor of Jainism and Buddhism from the University of California at Berkeley.
We went to visit him, and when we showed him a chart showing the number of animals that are exported to the Middle East, basically for meat, he was shocked. He was almost to tears. And so I think it's a matter of educating people, because some of these habits take a while to dispel, or to change, especially eating habits. People are so tied culturally to food. And what another part of that education is to talk about how there are now these alternatives being generated. I mean, you can get flax milk, you can get soy milk, you can get oat milk, you can get rice milk, you can get coconut milk.
So Indian vegans have innovated ideas such as making plant milk from a combination of peanut and rice. They also have used cashew. They've made soya milk, just like in other parts of the world, almond milk. And they have a unique way of culturing the curd or yogurt, which is using the stems of hot peppers. I've not seen that anywhere else. And the Indian climate, since it's warm, is conducive to making curd easily. So beyond this, we know that much of Indian cuisine is easy to make vegan. Simple substitutions can result in delicious food that requires very little sacrifice.
This fellow in Arizona, his name is Amish Shah, and he started a vegan festival. So now he didn't think that there would be that many people interested, but it's become wildly successful as a vegan and vegetarian food festival. So people are coming to try all these new foods.
Jain sadhvis and sadhus are increasingly recognizing the violence involved in the dairy industry. It's been helpful for those in India that have had dialogues with our nuns and monks to raise awareness. And I will show you a place that you can go to see some of their statements. So here I'm sharing my screen, and I hope you can see that we have on this Vegan Jain site a whole category of Jain ascetics, so nuns and monks and Bhatarakji in this case, that talk about why veganism makes sense.
For a community that lives minimizing their impact on environment, do they fight, do they protest against violence, do they raise their voices when they see environment being violated or exploited?
Throughout history, Jain monks and nuns have protested slaughter. They have convinced rulers such as Ashoka to temporarily ban slaughter on holy days. And they've even advocated and passed a rule for Palitana to be considered a vegetarian city. So in some areas, they've certainly been activists. And as I discussed in an earlier segment, some number of nuns and monks have realized the hinsa in dairy, and they're now speaking out against the consumption of dairy and all of the violence related to that. I am not aware of a concerted environmental activism by Jain nuns and monks in India, but because I live here, it's very possible that there have been some statements made that I'm not aware of.
So one of the interesting things is that there's sort of this concept of that Jains work on their own spiritual enlightenment, that they, you work inwardly, you try to perfect your own self and not get involved. In fact, monks and religious people, they sort of remove themselves from the world and they don't get involved with the world. But there's a passage here in this book. Jains have rarely understood ahimsa as involving them in participation in movements to minimize violence in society at large, or in efforts to resist war and militarization. But environmentalists ask if such a narrow compasses for nonviolence should not be expanded. And that's been something that I've been very concerned about. The United States has a $760 billion war budget, and Jains never speak out against our military budget, even though it's larger than the next 6 largest countries in the world. So to me, if you're truly opposed to violence, you should be opposing these military budgets and opposing other people polluting the environment, these oil spills that we have, the burning down of the rainforest and such. Because again, your lifestyle, if you're driving a gasoline car, is contributing to people doing those activities.
Jains are a very diverse community. We know that there are Jains who are just making it by in their small shops. There are some Jains who are involved in organic farming. There are some Jains who are running NGOs. There are some Jains who are doing big business. But I think we have to recognize, as a community, Jains are generally financially doing well, as a rule. Some of them own big businesses and small businesses that pollute the environment, that harm animals. And so my guess is that the reason that some Jains don't get involved in activism is because they don't want anything to harm their interests financially. And sometimes the interest in money gets to be a barrier in really following other values.
What was your community's response to your declaration?
Again, the reception has been relatively poor. I think we've been trying to get every temple to sign on to the declaration. We honestly haven't pushed too hard, but the number of people that have just sort of voluntarily joined has been fairly poor.
So what happens once the declaration is out in the public domain?
Usually nothing happens. L.M. Singhvi wrote the Jain Declaration on Nature 30 years ago, and I would bet that 99% of Jains have never heard of it. We have sort of a concerted effort to synchronize patshalas in our temples, and there's actually a chapter in the patshala curriculum on environment, but it's been empty for years. I mean, it was put there by somebody, but there's almost nothing in there. So we would like, now that we have this declaration, to try to create curriculum for patshalas to teach young kids about environment and climate change.
Go ahead, tell us what your declaration is all about.
L.M. Singhvi wrote that Jainism was inherently a religion for the environment, but it was never created. He doesn't say this, but this book talks about it. But back when Jainism was founded or started, there was no issues of the environment. People didn't talk about environment. That's sort of a new concept, but we're in an environmental crisis in the world, and the declaration basically says that Jain principles can be considered to be very effective solutions to some of our environmental crises.
This is a declaration that Sudhanshu, Jain, and I wrote, and it was approved by the Executive Committee of Jina in 2019. We did our best to produce a statement that had scientifically backed evidence about climate change, the causes, and what we can do about it. And I can show you a slideshow that will help explain what we were trying to do. So I'm going to share my screen In the declaration, we discuss actions we can do. What can we do as individuals? We can continue avoiding meat and eggs, minimizing use of water, and avoiding food waste. Here I've said continue because this is supposed to be what Jains traditionally are already doing. Then we've got to move further beyond the tradition to other steps, such as eliminating dairy products to transition to a completely plant-based or vegan diet. As I've explained in previous segments, in the area of transportation, we can limit the use of cars that use fossil fuels and emit carbon. And better yet, we could do car sharing, use electric vehicles, and where possible, go completely car-free, instead walking and biking. And if we think about the example of Jain nuns and monks, they do not use any vehicles. They only walk. They are our true examples. When we resume travel again after COVID, it will be an important personal action to reduce the amount of flights that we take. And in our use of energy at home, if we live in smaller homes and use renewable energy such as solar, we can reduce our contribution to climate change. Every item that we buy should be considered very carefully. We should buy less material goods because those goods require energy to produce, and at some point they have to be disposed of, which all adds burden to our earth. And importantly, for those of us who are working, as individuals, we can really consider the impact of our work or our business on the climate, considering whether we're making things better or making things worse, and trying as much as we can to improve the situation. How do we figure out our impact on the climate? Well, you can calculate your carbon footprint. There are various carbon calculators. Two of them are shown here, terrapass.org and conservation.org. In the area of food, it is recommended that we choose organic when possible, and if available, veganic food in accordance with the HIMSA. Organic fruits and vegetables are more nutritious for consumers. They're healthier for those who work on farms. They don't get exposed to pesticides that can cause diseases and affect the next generation. Organic fruits and vegetables may still use animal matter to fertilize the soil and insects to kill other insects. So they're not HIMSA free. And there is a movement of what's called veganic farming, which is to use only items that do not include byproducts of slaughter. Now, as a community, we can learn together about climate change. We can consider the availability of public transportation and planning where to locate temples. So in the US, many of the temples are located in suburbs, facilitate the arrangement of carpools for people to get to the temple while minimizing the greenhouse gas emissions. Serve only vegan food and use only vegan items in pujas, in those sects that do have pujas. We can eliminate the use of styrofoam and single-use plastics in the serving of food. Use reusable plates and cutlery where possible, and otherwise use compostable or biodegradable products so as to minimize waste in our landfills. Our sadhus and sadhvis who obtain their food from householders would never use disposable products. The Digambar Munis take the food that they can cup in their hands. The Svetambar sadhvis and sadhus have some stacking containers that they collect food in and they wash and they reuse. We Jains in the West, and I think also in India, have become convenience oriented. And instead of following the examples of our ascetics, we have resorted to polluting our environment because it's so easy and cheap to find styrofoam and plastic and not have to think about cleaning up. This is not defensible. And it is really important to bring our own bavalas or water bottles, bring our own plates and knives and forks in situations where they're not provided, but in temples or other community settings, we should do our best to use reusable plates and cutlery and have them at those facilities. And where possible, we should consider energy-saving technologies for our temples and considering adding solar panels. People see waste on the streets and in the common spaces in India very commonly. You see so much of this, and this is the landfill. We have to think about everything that we throw away affecting all the animals. You see all the birds here that are going to be poisoned by the plastic and all of the contents of the waste here in the landfill. And the oceans are also polluted. This is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. 8 million tons of plastic land in the ocean every year. And besides the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, there's 4 more of these. These are poisoning all of the beings in the ocean, the fish and every other kind of creature. So we've talked a little bit about individual actions and community actions. We also, as a Jain community, can have advocacy and have an advocacy role and ask our business and government leaders to do their part. We can demonstrate in our policies and institutions that we value peace and health of all living beings rather than allowing some to benefit at the expense of others. We can ask business and government leaders to facilitate the transition to agriculture that supports all living beings, like the veganic type that we talked about, that reverses the process of global heating. This is global heating, not just global warming. It's extreme now, and associated extreme weather events. And we want agriculture that supports regeneration. We would advocate for removal of subsidies for the meat and dairy industries. It should not be made cheaper to exploit and kill other beings. There should be an elimination of favorable treatment for fertilizer and pesticide companies. And we should incentivize the research and development of agricultural practices using no chemical pollutants or byproducts of animal cruelty. We should remove subsidies for fossil fuels so that we can transition away from them and impose a price on carbon that accounts for the external extraction and transportation and burning costs to society from these fuels. We would propose that business and government leaders invest in public transportation using renewable technologies, including high-speed rail systems, and plan living areas for walkability and bicycle safety. This is huge in India. We see how the roads are clogged and congested, and it's so difficult for people to walk safely, and for bicyclists to be safe, and for motorcyclists and scooters to all fit in a safe manner. We propose that business and government leaders ban non-biodegradable or single-use plastic and incentivize green alternatives in business. We need to protect living beings on undeveloped land from deforestation and exploitation. And we need to support practices and vetted technologies to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, including massive reforestation, as well as research and development of new technologies. So these are all examples. We haven't listed every possibility, but these are some of the big actions that we have included in the Jain Declaration on the Climate Crisis. And how do we do this? How do we advocate? How do we communicate with our business and government leaders, with others in the community, with our neighbors? Well, we should advocate with love, grace, and gentleness. Traditionally, in environmental circles, we are advised to reduce, reuse, and recycle to minimize our impact on climate change. Well, we'd like to add renounce or refuse. Renunciation is an important value in traditional Jainism, not participating in something that causes harm. So practically what this means is if someone gives you something like a plastic water bottle, you don't have to take it. For some things, if you have to use them, reduce your amount, reuse it, and finally recycle. But we know that energy goes into recycling, so it's not the solution that some people wish it was. In our traditional Jain teachings, there's a saying called Parasparo Pagraho Jivanam. All living beings are mutually interdependent and help each other. And some of the other actions we can do are we can teach children about climate change, about the issues and the solutions in our pathshala, and in our own rituals such as pratikaman, we can reflect and improve ourselves. So these are all the ways that we can incorporate love, gentleness, and grace in transitioning to a better world.
That's all for today. I'll meet you next Tuesday.